When I first stepped onto the tree-lined streets of New Prospect Hills, I felt a wave of relief and optimism. My career had taken me to a bustling city on the opposite coast, so I was eager to settle into a quieter, slower-paced environment. The real estate agent had praised the neighborhood's strong sense of community, largely due to the homeowners association that organized events and maintained the landscaping. On the surface, it looked perfect: well-manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, wide sidewalks for kids to ride their bikes, and a neat row of single-family homes painted in tasteful, neutral palettes. As I drove down the main avenue, spotting children playing, neighbors chatting over fences, and small decorative streetlights glowing softly in the early evening, I imagined a friendly, welcoming environment. The house I purchased was a three-bedroom, single-story structure on a quiet cul-de-sac. It had a brick facade, an attached two-car garage, and a tidy front garden with a few rose bushes. The backyard offered enough space for gatherings or simply relaxing. Moving day was hectic but invigorating. Boxes piled high in the living room, the smell of fresh paint drifting in from newly touched-up walls. With my father's health in decline, I'd insisted he come live with me rather than stay alone in his older home across town. I set up the third bedroom as his own suite, wanting to ensure he had a peaceful, comfortable environment. Little did I know, this move would thrust us into a conflict beyond anything I could have predicted, involving an HOA president whose meddling would soon push ethical and moral boundaries. For the first week, I was too busy unpacking to fully appreciate the neighborhood dynamic. Neighbors occasionally waved as they passed, and I made a mental note to introduce myself once the place looked presentable. In the meantime, I took comfort in the promise of a stable community, hoping my father would find quiet solace in this well-maintained environment. I had heard about HOA Karens in internet jokes, stories about overly controlling or entitled people in charge of a neighborhood association. It was a funny meme, and I assumed it was an exaggeration. Then I met Karen Monroe in person. On a bright Monday morning, I was rummaging in the garage, sorting a few leftover boxes, when I heard a sharp rap on the front door. I patted across the tile floor, opened up, and found a woman with a precisely trimmed blonde bob standing there. She wore a navy blazer, crisp khaki pants, and carried a clipboard emblazoned with the letters NPHA, New Prospect Hills Homeowners Association. Her lips were pressed in a thin line, and her eyes held the sort of intense scrutiny usually reserved for customs agents at the airport. "Hello," she greeted in a well-practiced, formal tone. "You must be the new homeowner. I'm Karen Monroe, the president of our HOA." She extended her hand, but even as she did, her gaze darted past me into the house, as if cataloging any potential violations or infractions. I offered a cordial smile and shook her hand. "Hi, I'm James. Nice to meet you." Karen nodded. "I see you've moved in nicely, though I noticed your trash bins are at the curb. Today is not trash pickup day, so they need to be stored by the side of the house or in the garage. We maintain uniformity here, very important for property values." Her tone was matter-of-fact, verging on condescending. I nodded, not wanting to start off on the wrong foot. "I was just finishing up some cleaning in the garage, but I'll bring them in shortly." She scribbled something on her clipboard. "Please do. Also, I'd appreciate it if you could sign up for the HOA's official forum. We post updates, guidelines, and reminders there." Another cursory glance into the house. "And we also require that you schedule an inspection if you've made any modifications to the exterior. Did you? The paint on your trim seems fresh." I explained that it was the prior owner who had painted the trim before selling. She nodded curtly. "Well, just be sure to fill out the standard form so we can have it on file." Before I could respond, Karen pivoted to a gentler tone, though it still carried an edge. "We hold monthly social gatherings. The next is a potluck dinner in 2 weeks at the clubhouse. You should come. It's an excellent way to meet neighbors." She then offered a polite but hollow smile, handed me a packet of HOA documents, and made her exit. I felt mildly unsettled, but tried to remain positive. Perhaps she was just strict about rules for the sake of the neighborhood. I had no idea how far her meddling could reach, nor how personal her intrusions would become once she discovered my father's medical needs. Over the next few weeks, Karen's presence was inescapable. I would see her pacing the sidewalks each morning with that ever-present clipboard, pausing at each house to jot notes. At times, she'd squint at a lawn, shake her head, and scribble vigorously, presumably marking some minor violation. Other times, she'd photograph front yards. It was unsettling, like living under surveillance. I soon learned she emailed courtesy reminders at all hours. My inbox began to fill with her messages referencing sections of the HOA bylaws. Subject: exterior lighting. Please ensure your front porch lights are consistent with the community's color temperature guidelines. Harsh, bright LED or colored lights are discouraged. Subject: street parking. No overnight parking on the street between 2 to 5 a.m. Residents violating this rule may face a fine. Subject: garden decor. Decorative ornaments are to remain modest in scale and number. Large statues or multiple lawn ornaments can detract from uniformity. Though it felt intrusive, these were general bulletins. I tried to ignore most of them, focusing on helping my father settle in. Still, a pattern was emerging. Karen thrived on micromanagement. And if she learned of something unusual, like daily medical personnel arriving, there was no telling what she might do. Meanwhile, my father's health was delicate. At 77, he had a long history of heart complications. His mobility was limited, and he spent much of his time resting in a recliner by the living room window. Despite all this, I still clung to hope that living in a calm, quiet community might give him comfort. Little did I know that serenity would be disrupted by the very person entrusted with maintaining order in the neighborhood. As I observed neighbors from a distance, I noticed that many gave polite but terse hellos to Karen. No one seemed eager to chat at length. I overheard a frustrated conversation between a couple in their driveway about some letter they'd received regarding their overgrown shrubs. Another neighbor confided that Karen had complained about the color of their new door wreath, calling it visually jarring. Even so, most folks complied with her demands to avoid harassment. At this point, I wasn't sure if Karen's vigilance was truly beneficial or a sign of something more sinister. But in less than a month, her overreach would become painfully clear. My father's health had been an ongoing concern for years. He'd survived a triple bypass surgery, battled congestive heart failure, and weathered a stroke that left him with partial numbness in his right arm. Still, he remained mentally sharp, reading newspapers, watching documentaries, and maintaining a soft-spoken humor that endeared him to everyone. After settling him in the back bedroom, I noticed a worrisome downturn. He grew weaker, more fatigued. Simple tasks, like getting to the bathroom, became arduous. The local doctor, Dr. Sanchez, recommended more in-depth evaluations. A round of tests revealed advanced heart failure, complicated by kidney issues. I remember feeling numb when Dr. Sanchez gently said, "At this stage, comfort becomes the priority." It was a bleak moment, and I struggled to face the reality that my father's time might be limited. Rather than keep him in a clinical environment or shuffle him through hospital stays, we decided on home hospice care. My father, though never one to complain, agreed he wanted to remain at home, somewhere familiar, with family close by. Hospice care is not about giving up. It's about ensuring dignity, comfort, and proper support when medical science can no longer offer a cure. Medicare, by law, covers home hospice services if a doctor certifies the patient has a life expectancy of 6 months or less. Hospice nurses would come to our home regularly to monitor pain, address symptoms, and offer emotional support. Additional visits from social workers, chaplains, or therapists could be arranged. We also received medical equipment, such as a specialized bed, oxygen tanks, and mobility aids. At first, I worried about how frequently these hospice professionals would show up. Would the neighbors notice? Then I brushed off the concern, thinking, it's nobody's business. This is medically necessary. But in an HOA with Karen at the helm, nobody's business rarely existed. As soon as she spotted multiple visitors in scrubs arriving at my house, she would sense an opportunity to step in and take control. Just one day after Dr. Sanchez confirmed the hospice eligibility, I contacted a local hospice agency called Sunrise Compassionate Care. They had an excellent reputation, stressing personalized attention and a smooth transition for families. A coordinator named Beth arrived to assess the home, ensuring we had a suitable space for medical equipment. She was calm, professional, and kind, exactly what we needed. Within 2 days, a hospital bed arrived, set up in my father's bedroom. The mattress was designed to reduce bed sores, a crucial element for someone with limited mobility. Oxygen tanks and a small portable device for nebulizer treatments were delivered. We reorganized the room to allow for easy wheelchair movement. My father was quietly relieved. He disliked hospitals, and the idea of spending his remaining days there felt oppressive. Being in a home environment, where I could check on him frequently, offered him a sense of security. Medicare had specific requirements for hospice, including regular nurse visits, updates to the care plan, and 24/7 on-call support. These requirements ensure patients receive consistent, quality care. As the coordinator explained, we can't do a one-and-done approach. Medicare mandates frequent check-ins to monitor vitals, medication, and overall condition. This is crucial for ensuring comfort and safety. I nodded, grateful that the process would be thorough. By the end of that week, my father had daily visits from a nurse or a certified nursing assistant, CNA, for medication management, bathing, and vital checks. Additional visits from a social worker were scheduled weekly. It was a lot of traffic in and out of the house, but each visit offered a lifeline of support. Unfortunately, as soon as the new pattern of cars parking outside my house began, I noticed a pair of suspicious eyes peering from down the street. Karen was no fool. She recognized that something was happening in my home. And in typical Karen fashion, she would soon decide that the matter required her oversight. The initial conflict emerged subtly. I received an email from the HOA titled, "Concern about excessive daytime traffic." Right away, I suspected Karen's involvement. The text read, "Dear Mr., my last name. We have observed a notable increase in traffic flow to and from your residence during daytime hours. This includes various individuals arriving in professional attire, potentially for business purposes. As per the HOA Guidelines, Article 3, Section 5, any commercial or business activity within a residential home is prohibited unless explicitly approved by the board. Further, repeated vehicle visits that may disturb community peace should be addressed immediately. We kindly request clarification regarding these daytime visitors and any business operations you may be conducting. We value a peaceful living environment for all residents and hope you understand our need to maintain uniform standards. Sincerely, the New Prospect Hills HOA Board." Though the letter was signed, the board, the formal language, and pointed accusations clearly bore Karen's fingerprints. She must have seen the hospice nurses' cars, assumed I was running some sort of home clinic, and decided to intervene. My initial reaction was shock and anger. This was not business activity, but vital medical care for my terminally ill father. I responded politely, clarifying that these visits were home hospice care, fully covered under Medicare and medically necessary. "Hello. I am not operating any business. My father is receiving hospice care. The individuals arriving are licensed healthcare professionals providing essential services mandated by federal regulations. This is not optional. It is essential end-of-life care. I trust this resolves any misunderstanding. Regards, James." I hoped this explanation would be enough. However, Karen never let matters rest so easily. A mere 2 days later, I heard a knock at the door around midday and discovered Karen standing there, flanked by another board member, a timid man named Jason who avoided eye contact. Karen, in her usual clipped tone, said she had concerns that a stream of medical personnel might pose a public health risk or disrupt the neighborhood's tranquil setting. I tried to keep calm. "Karen, this is hospice care. It's legal, medically necessary, and my father is terminally ill. The visits are mandated by Medicare guidelines." She stiffened, pressing her lips together. "We have rules against commercial foot traffic. The bylaw states no enterprise is allowed that brings in professionals daily. I'm not sure hospice care is an exception." Jason cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe we should research that. Hospice might be protected by federal law," he mumbled. She shot him a look of annoyance, then turned back to me. Regardless, you should have informed the HOA about this. We need to ensure the repeated comings and goings don't inconvenience neighbors or clutter the street with parked cars. I felt a surge of frustration. Karen, these are medical professionals who come for short visits. They park in my driveway when possible. This is hardly a traffic jam scenario. Karen responded with a vague threat that she might need to review the specifics and decide if fines are warranted. Then, just as quickly as she arrived, she departed, leaving me feeling unsettled and furious. Jason gave me an apologetic shrug before following her out. The lines were drawn. My father's care was now under scrutiny by the HOA, led by a woman who had little empathy for the reality of end-of-life services. As word spread about Karen's reaction to the hospice visits, several neighbors quietly voiced their support for me. A kind couple across the street, Gina and Mark, dropped by with a plate of cookies, offering condolences and letting me know they were so sorry you have to deal with Karen's nonsense on top of your father's health issues. Another neighbor, Ravi, who lived 3 doors down, caught me during my walk to the mailbox and said, "Man, I heard she's trying to label hospice care as a business? That's just messed up." It became apparent that while Karen wielded power within the HOA, her popularity was not universal. Many residents were aware of her nitpicking ways and had felt her disapproval or micromanagement. They empathized with my situation, especially once they realized the seriousness of hospice care. Still, their sympathy often came in hushed, behind-the-scenes conversations. People didn't want to antagonize Karen openly, fearing fines or other punitive measures. To me, the situation was both absurd and heartbreaking. My father was in a precarious stage of life, deserving peace and dignity. Yet the HOA, through Karen, was complicating matters by questioning the legality or appropriateness of essential medical visits. The idea that we might need permission from a homeowners association to conduct hospice care in our own home felt surreal. Beth, our hospice coordinator, was appalled when I mentioned the conflict. "The law is on your side," she reassured. "No HOA can override federally mandated hospice benefits. It's part of your father's rights as a Medicare beneficiary. If they continue to harass you, we can put them in touch with our legal department." The notion of involving lawyers seemed extreme, but it comforted me to know hospice agencies had encountered similar battles before and understood how to defend patients' rights. Meanwhile, the daily visits continued, nurses checking vitals, aides assisting with bathing and grooming, a chaplain stopping by once to offer spiritual comfort, and a social worker helping me manage the emotional toll. My father, unaware of the brewing HOA drama, appreciated the consistent care, especially the nurse named Paula who frequently brought a gentle smile and warm conversation. If Karen had her way, all these visits would be cast under a suspicious light, as though our home had become a commercial clinic instead of what it truly was, a place of compassion and solace for a dying man. The frequency of hospice visits grew. My father's condition fluctuated, requiring more attentive management. Some days, his pain levels spiked unexpectedly, prompting extra calls to the nurse. Equipment adjustments were made to keep him comfortable. A specialized air mattress was delivered to help prevent sores. The living room soon had a small station of medical supplies, pill bottles, gloves, and charts. Each new wave of professionals raised Karen's eyebrows further. I spotted her outside one day, staring intently as a CNA in scrubs carried supplies into my house. She marched up to the poor CNA to demand her name and the nature of her business. The CNA politely stated that she was providing hospice care. Karen retorted something about not recalling any such arrangement being approved. The CNA wisely ended the conversation and entered the house, shaken. After hearing that encounter, I confronted Karen on the sidewalk. "Stop harassing the nurses," I said, voice taut. "My father's well-being is not subject to your HOA bureaucracy." She folded her arms. "I'll ask the questions I see fit. If you'd followed the proper channels and informed the association from the start, I wouldn't need to do so now." "Proper channels?" I echoed bitterly. "No one has to inform the HOA about hospice care. It's a private matter." Her eyes glinted. Private or not, this is a community that thrives on established rules. We don't appreciate daily disruptions. I opened my mouth to argue further, but she turned and walked away, leaving me fuming. That evening, I rummaged through the HOA bylaws, searching for any clause that might hint at restricting medical visits. Unsurprisingly, I found none, just references to limiting commercial enterprises and excessive foot traffic. Medical visits for an ill resident obviously didn't qualify. Yet Karen's strategy was intimidation by insinuation. By writing letters and scolding me verbally, she tried to conjure an image of wrongdoing on my part. She might not have legal standing, but she knew how to sow confusion and tension. I grew worried that I'd be bombarded with formal warnings, or that she might escalate her tactics. My father remained oblivious to the specifics. I shielded him from the drama, only telling him that the HOA was curious about the nurses. He frowned at the mention, lamenting, "I hope they won't force you to move me somewhere else." The sadness in his eyes cut me deeply. I reassured him that no one had that power. Our neighbors might have an overzealous association president, but hospice care was protected under federal law, no matter how Karen tried to spin it. Despite my thorough explanations, the official HOA communications ramped up. I received a warning letter alleging that I was violating neighborhood peace due to daily medical intrusions and referencing the unapproved operation of a health-related service within a private residence. They threatened fines if I did not rectify the situation. An invitation to address the HOA board. They requested my voluntary presence at the next board meeting to discuss the matter. The language was formal, but the subtext was intimidation. Karen, presumably, wanted me to come defend my father's hospice care in front of an entire board. Flyers taped to my door, anonymous notices complaining about excess foot traffic that made the street look unkempt. One read, "We didn't move to New Prospect Hills to see a stream of professional strangers daily. Please respect your neighbors." Though unsigned, I suspected Karen or her small circle of supporters. Each new note or letter chipped away at my patience. I gathered them into a folder, preparing to present them to Beth from the hospice agency. She shook her head in disbelief. I've heard stories of HOAs complaining about ramps or wheelchair accessibility changes, but never about the visits themselves. That's a new low. As the pressure mounted, I found myself lying awake at night, anxious about the next move. My father's condition also showed signs of decline, more labored breathing, deeper fatigue. The last thing I wanted was to wage a bureaucratic war when I should be focusing on his well-being. Yet Karen's hostility demanded a response. Ignoring it felt risky. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. If Karen wanted a formal discussion, I'd show up and lay out the facts. The meeting took place at the neighborhood clubhouse, a small but well-kept venue near the entrance of New Prospect Hills. About 20 residents showed up, seated on folding chairs, while the 5 board members, including Karen, sat at a long table up front. Karen called the meeting to order, rattling off a list of minor agenda items, the new landscaping vendor, an update on the community pool hours, and a reminder about holiday decoration restrictions. Each topic elicited mild conversation. At last, we arrived at Item 7, ongoing discussion regarding excessive daytime visits at a particular home. Everyone seemed to know it referred to me. Karen introduced the topic in her typical, emotionless manner. "We have concerns about repeated professional traffic to one of our residences, causing potential disruption." She didn't mention hospice, likely hoping the audience would assume it was some unscrupulous enterprise. That was my cue. I stood up from my seat, folder in hand. "Good evening, everyone. My name is James, and I'm the homeowner in question. Before we start, let me clarify, these daily visits are medical professionals providing hospice care for my dying father." A ripple of surprise and discomfort spread through the room. A few people bowed their heads. Others cast disapproving glances at Karen. She cleared her throat. "We understand it's medical, but the repeated traffic is not typical for a residence. We need to ensure compliance with the bylaws." I held up one of her letters. "This letter here claims I'm operating a health-related service. This is not a service for profit. It's a government-regulated hospice program, fully protected by federal law. My father has every right to receive these visits. I don't see how the HOA's bylaws override national healthcare regulations. Murmurs of agreement rose from some neighbors. One board member, Marta, tentatively asked, "Is there anything about hospice or medical visits in the bylaws that might conflict?" I turned to the relevant page, though there was no direct mention of medical visits. No, there's no clause. The only mention is about restricting commercial or for-profit activities and ensuring that foot traffic doesn't disrupt neighbors. I have not received any direct complaints from neighbors about the nurses. They come quietly, park properly, and leave. Karen tried to regain control, flipping through her notes. We have to ensure that the community remains peaceful. Even if it's not for profit, daily visits can be disruptive. A man in the audience, whom I recognized as Ravi, stood up. "Karen, you're overstepping. Hospice is not a mere visit, it's essential healthcare for a terminal patient. I think it's disrespectful to classify it as a nuisance." Another neighbor, Gina, chimed in. "I live across the street from James. The nurses don't bother anyone. This is a moral issue. He's taking care of his father." A wave of support built in the room. Karen's face tightened. She attempted to pivot to parking issues, but Marta interjected that James's visitors weren't blocking driveways or roads, so there was no violation. Karen's last fallback argument was about not being informed in advance, to which I calmly responded, "I didn't realize a private healthcare matter needed the HOA's blessing." The board, sensing the public mood, refrained from supporting Karen's push. They ended up tabling the matter with a vague note that James's situation is unique and will consult with legal advisors to clarify the bylaw's scope. In truth, the meeting had been a victory for me. Publicly cornered, Karen didn't quite relent, but she had no immediate path to punish me. Still, the tension lingered. Outside, after the meeting, Karen walked by me without a word. I suspected her next steps might be more cunning and less public. A few days later, I was on the porch trimming some potted plants when Karen appeared. I noticed she was alone, no clipboard in hand, and her expression was subdued. "James," she said softly, "can we talk?" I was wary but decided to hear her out. She gestured to a bench on the porch. With a sigh, she began, "This entire situation has caused quite an uproar in the neighborhood. I've received multiple emails accusing me of lacking compassion. That's not fair. I'm only trying to uphold the standards we set." I studied her. "Karen, your approach to hospice care has hurt a lot of people, me included. You can see why folks are upset, right?" She stiffened, as though the concept of introspection pained her. "Perhaps I was a bit direct," she said reluctantly. "But it's my duty to ensure the rules are enforced equally for everyone." I recalled my father's fragility, his quiet acceptance of his condition, and the warmth of the hospice team. Then I gazed at Karen, trying to gauge if there was any genuine remorse. Hospice is not an optional courtesy. It's a necessity. I can't limit these visits without endangering my father's care. Karen's lips twitched, perhaps a glimmer of empathy threatened to show. "It's just that, from the association's perspective, we're worried about setting precedents, like if someone else starts having daily visits for other reasons." "That might be," I replied, "but the law is clear. And morally, do you really want to stand in the way of an elderly man's final days of comfort?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the floor, mumbled something about looking out for the neighborhood, and departed. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, nor a complete retraction of her stance. But there was a flicker of uncertainty behind her stern mask. Maybe, just maybe, she realized the moral tightrope she was walking. Unfortunately, that porch conversation did not resolve anything. Within a week, I received another letter, this time referencing a safety concern for the community. It alleged that medical waste could be an issue, citing reports, unverified of course, that hazardous materials might be disposed of improperly. The letter threatened a significant fine if any trash with medical or biohazardous content was found in standard bins. This was truly grasping at straws. Hospice workers properly disposed of any medical waste or sharps according to strict regulations. They either took them off-site or used specialized containers. No trace of biohazards ever went into my regular trash. Karen's new angle was a scare tactic. She hoped the mere mention of hazardous waste would alarm neighbors and give her leverage. I forwarded the letter to Beth from Sunrise Compassionate Care, who nearly laughed at the absurdity. "We keep strict protocols," she said. "If the HOA tries to fine you for imaginary medical waste, we can challenge them. This is borderline harassment." Encouraged by her support, I penned a firm response. To the New Prospect Hills HOA, I have received a letter alleging improper disposal of medical waste. This accusation is baseless. The hospice team adheres to strict medical guidelines for disposal. There is no hazardous material in our household trash. Continual attempts to interfere in my father's legally mandated hospice care can be construed as harassment. I kindly request that the HOA refrain from unfounded accusations and respect our privacy. Sincerely, James. I copied the hospice agency and even a local patients' rights advocacy group, letting them know what was happening. If Karen persisted, I intended to escalate. But for a time, the letters stopped. Maybe she realized she was treading in legally dangerous territory. Around this time, I received a call from the hospice agency's legal consultant, Christine. She explained in detail the legal protections for home hospice care. Medicare regulations: patients who qualify for hospice under Medicare are entitled to receive home visits from licensed providers without interference. Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, although typically associated with physical or mental disabilities, the principle of reasonable accommodation can extend to essential medical services. State health laws: many states explicitly protect the right to in-home medical or palliative care. Christine said, if your HOA is threatening or penalizing you for these visits, they risk a discrimination lawsuit. Also, any attempt to bar hospice staff from entering your property is illegal under healthcare regulations. She recommended that I keep documenting every letter, email, or conversation. This phone call buoyed my spirits. I had known, intuitively, that Karen's stance was untenable, but now I had explicit confirmation. I saved Christine's number in case matters escalated further. Meanwhile, my father's condition continued to worsen. He was sleeping more, eating less, and experiencing more frequent bouts of shortness of breath. The hospice team made additional visits to manage new symptoms. Karen's harassment seemed to subside for a few weeks, though I noticed her passing by my house more often, eyeing the driveway, occasionally taking photos. Neighbors whispered that she was gathering evidence to present to the board. But by then, the neighborhood sympathy was firmly on my side. People waved encouragingly when they saw the nurses arrive, occasionally dropping off little notes or food for me and my father. Despite the tensions, life rolled on. My father's health spiraled downward, and he entered what hospice staff termed the active dying phase. His energy was almost gone, voice barely above a whisper. I took time off work, determined to be by his side. We shared long, quiet hours reminiscing about family memories, trips from my childhood, and the little joys that made life special. The nurses kept him comfortable, adjusting meds to ease his pain, and I felt immensely grateful for their empathy. One afternoon, a young nurse named Tessa arrived. She parked at the curb because my driveway was full of visiting relatives' cars. As Tessa walked to the house carrying her medical bag, Karen stepped onto the sidewalk, arms folded. I didn't hear everything she said, but Tessa later told me Karen demanded to know, when will these daily visits stop? This is a residential neighborhood, not a clinic. Tessa, caught off guard, replied politely that she had a legal right to be there. Karen responded with something along the lines of, well, you won't have that right if I call the authorities to report unauthorized medical procedures. Tessa refused to engage further and knocked on my door. As Tessa and I headed to my father's room, I heard a sharp crash from outside. Alarmed, I rushed to the living room window in time to see Karen standing near Tessa's car, her face pale. The side mirror on Tessa's vehicle was hanging by a wire, shattered glass on the pavement. I threw open the door. What happened? I shouted, my heart pounding. Karen stammered. I was backing up and didn't see the mirror. I lost my balance. My purse might have hit it. She seemed shaken, but from my vantage point, it looked suspicious. The mirror was quite high off the ground for a random bump with a purse. Tessa came out, saw the damage, and gasped. Another neighbor, who was walking their dog, paused to observe. Everything about Karen's explanation sounded off. If it was truly an accident, why was there so much damage? The neighbor, Tim, quietly told me I saw Karen messing around near the car, kind of fiddling with the mirror. Then it snapped. Tim's statement suggested it was more than an accident. Tessa was visibly upset. She said softly to Karen, "You broke my mirror." "You realize that's vandalism, right?" Karen's face flushed. She muttered, "It was an accident. I'll pay for the repairs," then stormed off before we could question her further. Tessa had to call the police to file a report for insurance purposes. An officer arrived, took statements, and left us with a case number. Karen avoided the scene entirely. This was the incident that turned the tide of opinion even more strongly against Karen. A nurse's car had been damaged under suspicious circumstances. Why would anyone tamper with the vehicle of someone providing end-of-life care to a neighbor's father? It was unconscionable. The rumor mill in the neighborhood exploded. People who once defended Karen or stayed neutral now condemned her for stooping to harassment and possibly vandalism. In the wake of Tessa's car mirror incident, the community's simmering resentments toward Karen boiled over. A flurry of posts appeared on the neighborhood's private forum. Residents who'd previously been silent came forward with grievances about her intrusive inspections, rude remarks, and threats of fines for trivial issues. One woman recalled how Karen had humiliated her for putting up wind chimes. Another man recounted Karen's meltdown over a toy left on the sidewalk. Ravi started a petition calling for Karen's removal from the HOA board, citing her pattern of harassment and potential vandalism. Within days, over half the homeowners signed it. Usually, removing a board member required a formal process. Bylaws demanded a recall vote at a specially convened meeting. But the outpouring of support was immediate and overwhelming. Meanwhile, Tessa filed an insurance claim. The police labeled the incident as possible accidental damage, but Tim's eyewitness statement left out. If Karen refused to pay for the mirror, Tessa could escalate legally. Karen, presumably sensing the mounting backlash, apologized to Tessa privately and agreed to cover the repair costs. It was too little, too late for her reputation. I continued focusing on my father's final days, grateful for the love from neighbors. People asked how they could help. Some offered to run errands, others dropped off home-cooked meals. The community embraced us, showing that Karen did not speak for everyone. This communal compassion was a heartening contrast to Karen's hostility. It became clear that a special HOA meeting would be scheduled soon. The board members, wanting to quell the unrest, arranged for a vote regarding Karen's leadership. Rumors swirled that Karen considered stepping down to avoid the humiliation of a public ouster. Yet no official announcement came, and tension lingered in the air. That tension culminated at the special HOA meeting a few weeks later. My father's condition, tragically, had deteriorated even further, but I managed to slip away for a short time to attend this pivotal gathering. I felt it was important to represent the hospice cause and to ensure that Karen's misdeeds, especially the repeated harassment, were formally addressed. The community center was packed far beyond the usual turnout. Chairs lined every wall. Some neighbors stood at the back. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Karen sat at the board table, flanked by Jason and Marta, who looked grimly uncomfortable. Ravi stepped forward first, holding the petition. I have here over 70 signatures from residents who believe Ms. Karen Monroe has repeatedly abused her position, targeted homeowners unjustly, and undermined the sense of community we cherish. The vandalism incident involving the hospice nurse's car is the final straw. We're asking for her immediate resignation. A series of speakers followed, recounting Karen's petty rules, fear tactics, and questionable conduct. One older gentleman, nearly in tears, described how Karen threatened fines because he put up a small ramp for his disabled wife without architectural review. Another neighbor described Karen's incessant late-night investigations for rule violations. By the time it was my turn, the mood was thoroughly against her. I stepped up. As many of you know, my father is on hospice care. Karen tried to classify legitimate medical visits as a violation of HOA bylaws. She harassed nurses, posted warnings, and created needless stress for someone in end-of-life care. This goes beyond minor inconveniences. It's morally reprehensible. Karen's face was pale, her usual composure cracking. She attempted to defend herself, claiming she was enforcing rules for the community's benefit. Her voice trembled as she insisted, "I never intended to disrespect anyone's health needs. I was only trying to maintain order." But no one seemed swayed. The wide gap between order and her actions had become unbridgeable. The board members announced they would open the floor to a recall vote. Under the bylaws, if a certain percentage of homeowners present supported removal, Karen would be stripped of her title as president. Hands shot up, some neighbors shouting, "Aye." Marta counted them methodically, but it was clear from the wave of arms raised that Karen's time was over. The recall passed overwhelmingly. Karen's eyes glistened with tears. She stood, muttered something about everyone turning on her, and shoved her papers into a bag. Then she fled the room, pushing through the crowd. The meeting concluded with Jason announcing an interim president would take over, pending new elections. The mood in the room was one of relief and subdued triumph. In the days that followed, Karen faced the official consequences of her actions. Removal from office, she was immediately stripped of her presidency and her seat on the board, effective that night. Possible legal repercussions. Tessa's insurance claim was finalized, and Karen had to pay out of pocket for the mirror damage plus any associated fees. The police, though not pressing charges for vandalism, placed a note in the official record that Karen's accidental damage was in dispute. Community shunning, Karen's name became synonymous with abuse of power. She was ostracized socially. Neighbors who once tolerated her simply avoided interaction. Some wrote formal letters to the HOA demanding that she be barred from ever holding an official position again. Public apology, part of the settlement with Tessa's insurance company, involved a written statement acknowledging Karen's responsibility for the car mirror damage. This effectively amounted to a forced admission of guilt. Word spread quickly that Karen was considering selling her home and leaving New Prospect Hills altogether. Whether she stayed or left, her reign of intimidation was broken. The new interim president circulated a reassuring statement to the neighborhood, emphasizing cooperation, empathy, and understanding as core values going forward. Many joked it was the polar opposite approach to Karen's entire tenure. For me personally, the biggest relief was that no more letters or suspicious notes appeared at my door. The hospice team came and went without interference. Neighbors were kinder and more open about offering help. The dark cloud had lifted from the otherwise tranquil streets of New Prospect Hills. In the final weeks of my father's life, I was able to focus fully on his comfort, free from the ominous presence of Karen and her misguided attempts to regulate hospice care. Surrounded by caring professionals, he passed peacefully one cool autumn morning, holding my hand. The house was quiet, but a sense of love lingered. Love from the nurses who gently tended to him, from neighbors who dropped off dinners or offered prayers, and from the understanding that we had done everything possible to honor his dignity. After the funeral, the neighborhood wrapped us in compassion. Friends, acquaintances, and even those I barely knew came by with condolences or heartfelt letters. The hospice agency sent a grief counselor for a few sessions. While the sorrow of losing my father was heavy, I felt gratitude for the good people who had stood with me against Karen's relentless meddling. Their support highlighted the best aspects of living in a community. The HOA itself underwent a transformation. With Karen gone, the board pledged to revise some rules to ensure no one else could misuse them so drastically. The new president, Marta, publicly stated that health-related visits, be they hospice, home health aides, or physical therapy, were always welcome and protected within the guidelines. The bylaw referencing excess foot traffic was reworded to exclude healthcare providers and caregivers. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of Karen from afar, pale, withdrawn, less confident than before. She no longer patrolled the sidewalks with a clipboard. If she made eye contact, she quickly looked away, as though too ashamed to face the people she once terrorized. There was talk that she planned to put her house on the market, but even if she stayed, her influence had evaporated. New Prospect Hills would no longer tolerate an HOA Karen dictating how people lived. Life moved on. Seasons changed. I planted a small memorial rosebush in the front yard for my father, a subtle reminder of his gentle spirit. The neighbors who saw me tending it would smile or nod in approval. No one questioned whether it conformed to the uniform aesthetic. They knew it was a symbol of love, compassion, and acceptance. And so ended Karen's reign of petty tyranny. In the end, her overreach was the impetus for a renewed sense of unity among the residents. The moral of the story echoed throughout the cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns. A community must stand together against unjust rules and those who misuse authority. Together, neighbors can create a place where everyone's dignity is respected, even in the quiet, final days of life.